Hello and greetings from Chicago. My name is Sebastian Burka and I'm the Executive Director of the Stigler Center. Today, we're happy to host a conversation with Filippo Lancieri and Luigi Zingales on their recent paper, The Conflict of Interest Discount in the Marketplace of Ideas, moderated by Stefano Feltri. Thank you all for taking the time out of your busy schedules for this relevant and timely conversation. If you haven't already, you can read the paper on the Stigler Center's working paper series on our website, along with many other fine scholarly contributions. Before we begin, I would like to highlight a few upcoming events. On October 30th, the Center will host the first live online recording of our podcast, Capital Isn't, co-hosted by Luigi and Bethany McLean, where they will interview acclaimed author and historian Neil Ferguson. Please consider subscribing to our podcast if you haven't already for more insightful content. Our upcoming episode will be released next Thursday and features investigative reporter Brody Mullins on his latest book, The Wolves of K Street. And on October 31st, join us for a hybrid event with Karthik Ramana and John Paul Rollert as they discuss Karthik's new book, The Age of Outrage, How to Lead in a Polarized World. Please check our website for more details, as well as our publication, promarket.org. The relevant links are in the chat function at the bottom of your screen. Before we begin, please note we are on the record and we will post the event video on our YouTube channel later. If you have any questions for the speakers, you can submit them via the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screens. We have time for answers at the end. As usual, views expressed by guests are their own, not those of the Stigler Center or the University of Chicago. And now, please allow me to briefly introduce our speakers. Filippo Lancieri is an associate professor of law at Georgetown University Law Center and a Stigler Center fellow. His research focuses on understanding how governments shape markets and, in turn, how markets shape governments. Luigi Zingales is the faculty director of the Stigler Center and the Robert C. McCormack Distinguished Service Professor of Entrepreneurship and Finance here at Booth. His research interests span from corporate governance to financial development, from political economy to the economic effects of culture, and more. And last but not least, our moderator today is Stefano Feltri. He is a journalist and adjunct professor and communication advisor at the Institute for European Policymaking at Bocconi University. He is also a former managing editor of our own publication, ProMarket, the editor of the Substack website and newsletter Appunti, and the regular columnist for various publications. And now, without further ado, I turn it over to Stefano. Thank you.
Thank you, Sebastian. It's a great pleasure for me being here and moderating a conversation on a topic that very few people, both in academia and in the media, dare to discuss, which is conflict of interest. I don't know how many of you were familiar with the name of Joshua Wright before last June, when the Wall Street Journal published an unprecedented three-part profile on him. Wright was not only a professor at George Mason University, but more importantly, he was a consultant for some of the most influential big tech companies. His advice was highly valuable and expensive because he had also served as a commissioner at the FTC before becoming the director of the Global Antitrust Institute at George Mason. Although the name sounds like a research center, its main purpose was to channel corporate donations to sponsor research and even training foreign judges and regulators in luxurious locations. Basically, Professor Wright amasses millions of dollars through activities that closely resemble lobbying, much more than academic research. Yet, the academic community largely failed to recognize that something was wrong with that activities. Very few, and I like to mention Tommaso Valletti on ProMarket, raised concern about the true nature of this Global Antitrust Institute, which is still operating. But those warnings did not trigger any meaningful reaction. Actually, Joshua Wright's fall from grace is due just to multiple allegations of sexual misconduct, and not because he crossed all the ethical boundaries that should protect academic integrity from corporate influence. If you think that Wright's case is an anomaly in the antitrust community or in IO and in the law community, you might be mistaken. According to US Assistant Attorney General Jonathan Kanter, and I'm quoting a recent speech of his, we have a crisis of expertise in our antitrust and competition community, and it is growing. In this speech, Kanter argued that checks are being cut, university centers and institutes are being established, and conferences are being funded specifically to influence the evolution of expert thought in competition policy. All the money, I'm still quoting Kanter, is turning our experts into advocates, sometimes knowingly and directly, other times indirectly, by effective incentives and capturing institutions. Even if economists basically study incentives, apparently they usually don't care about their own incentives, and they do not admit that their incentives are affected by funding and money and career incentives and all the other form of influences that can make prejudice on academic integrity. Disclosure policies in academic journals have not been sufficient to prevent this intellectual corruption, which undermines the credibility also, and this is the most important part, also of legitimate academic research. The working paper we are presenting today marks a significant step forward in this debate, because for the first time we have a deeper understanding of how economists truly perceive conflict of interest and their impact on the credibility of academic research. Through surveys and rigorous data analysis, this paper provides evidence of the conflict of interest and provides the evidence that these conflicts matter far more than economists often acknowledge in public. This paper, at least this is my hope, should ignite an open debate in academia and beyond, especially in the media. As a journalist, I believe that newspaper and other media also plays a role on these issues, because as editors, we do not always verify the intellectual independence of the opinion pieces that we publish. Thanks to this excellent work of Luigi and Filippo and their co-authors, we now have a strong foundation to begin this important conversation. So I will hand now the floor over to Filippo for a presentation of the findings and the methodology in the paper. Then we open up the floor for Q&A, and Luigi can jump in after Filippo finishes the presentation, and he will be here to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stefano, for this great introductory remarks. I think that it helps set the stakes of this conversation, and also the amount of high-profile attention that this topic has been getting over the past months, I think, and in particular the past month. I think it's interesting to think that, so we started this project 2.5 years ago, okay? So it was nothing to do with the reactions to what's happening more recently. And actually, the foundation for why we decided to invest time in this project to really try to understand what's happening was not a notion that most of academia and most scholars have this level of embeddedness that Joshua Wright apparently had with companies and everyone else. You know, actually, it was the opposite. I think that some conversation that we're having back then was that academia is becoming more and more high profile in public conversations. And this is leading many scholars, the vast majority of like serious scholars really producing independent work, to getting better in relationships with companies and different types of like external influences without reflecting much about it. And I'll give you a good anecdote, I think, then I'll go to the presentation that kind of exemplifies this. So both yesterday and a month ago, the New York Times had 2 stories about political betting markets, basically like betting on the result of elections, right? And they were talking about like a balanced research, saying like basically saying like, oh, on one hand this can lead to insurance like against political risks. On the other hand, this can lead to manipulation, and then basically, but manipulation can end up manipulating elections itself. And then they say, oh, but this type of manipulation seems to be very low risk and being very short term. And then they basically quote a study that was actually put online in 2008. And has never been peer reviewed, has never been published in a peer review journal. And this study was by 2 serious scholars who were actually tackling this important problem. But back then they were using companies of political betting data from political betting companies to find that they are not prone to manipulation. So this was a study in 2008, picked by the New York Times now to write 2 big stories on a very important topic for today's world. And we have this kind of like relationship is not, people don't really think that much about this type of relationships and the consequences that they have. So I think this is what led us to write this paper, to understand what are these relationships, when do we think they are problematic, when we think they're not problematic, and how does the community and more general the population thinks about these types of conflicts of interest. And so I'll start with a brief presentation of our results. And the idea here is that we didn't expect that you all read the 80-so pages that we posted last week. So I'll just do a small survey, a small summary, and then we'll go to the discussion and go to the talk. So this is the paper that's out. You have in the chat the link to the study. This is done also with John Barrios, Joshua Levy, Shashank Singh, and Tommaso Valetti. And basically what we do is a series of surveys, okay? So we do a series of vignettes where we survey 3 different groups. So one group is what we're calling selected economists, and this is like the elite of the profession, members of the NBR, the CEPR. You basically have to be kind of elected and voted into one of these groups. Luigi is a member of this group. He can tell you more about it when he talks about it. But it's kind of like, think about the intellectual elite of the academic economists. And then we also have a survey of ordinary economists, which are basically like other academic economists. They're also producing academic research, but are not members of these elite groups. And then finally, we hired YouGov to do a survey of a representative sample of the US population. It's election period. Everybody understands how the samples work, but we basically have answers by people who should represent the average American in a way. And then what we do is that we expose these groups to different vignettes. And our vignettes all start in the same way. And also we have this general prompt saying you should assume that we're going to be talking about academic research that has been published in high-level top economic journals, so has been subject to strict peer review, has been subject to scrutiny. And then we're going to we basically tell them a little bit about the conclusion of the article, and then we tell them a little bit about a potential conflict of interest, and we ask them how does this infect their views on the article. So starting with a paper on data that connects a bit to my example that I just gave you. So for example, we have a vignette that talks about data ownership in ride sharing. And we say like, oh, you just finished reading a paper that studied the welfare impacts of ride sharing services after they enter into cities. And then for some people, they read that the cost of ride-sharing services outweighed their benefits, meaning that these were negative on welfare, so the services were not good for the cities they entered. For other papers, people read the opposite. So for other respondents, they read the opposite. So they were told that the benefits of ride-sharing services would outweigh the cost. So these were good for the cities where these companies entered. And then we initially asked them, like, okay, how much do you generally believe a paper published that has these conclusions? And then we would treat them, we would basically expose them and say, oh, and then after that, you read basically the first footnote of the paper, and this footnote clearly discloses, so there's no deception involved, that these analyses were produced using 2 different types of data. On one hand, the researchers used publicly available data that was provided by the city government. And on the other hand, on other types of people were exposed to a prompt that said the researchers used proprietary data provided by the ride-sharing company. And then we asked them, okay, how much does this knowledge that there is this kind of potential conflict, that is this relationship in the back door of the paper, let's put it like this, impacts your trust in the results? And they could either say that it increases their trust or it decreases their trust. And there were a couple of there was some kind of gradation of how much it increases or decreases trust. So that's basically the overall methodology of the article. And then so this basically presents the results for the ride-sharing company, for the ride-sharing vignette. So the red bar is ordinary Americans, is our YouGov pool. The blue bar is the ordinary economists, let's put it like this, the academic economists, they're not the elite. And then the green is Luigi and his colleagues, the elite, think about it like this. And then I think that the way of thinking about it is, so you should take 2 things from these results, okay? So first is that using public data, for example, actually increases everyone's trust on the results of the study, independent of the direction of the study itself. So independent on whether the entry of ride-sharing companies into a market is positive or benefit for the city, economists in particular, the average American doesn't care much, but economists in particular just say, that's good, that's a good study, I'm going to trust it more than I would otherwise without knowing the source of the data. But using private data actually has the opposite impact. So basically, if you use private data, everyone distrusts the results, and the magnitude of the distrust depends on the direction of the results. So basically, if people found that costs were higher than benefits, so the results went against the ride-sharing company that supplied the data, economists would basically not discount the results much, by around 5 or 6% on average, while average Americans will actually distrust more. But once the direction of the results is aligned with the interests of the companies supplying the data, the distrust actually grows by a lot. So for economists, it goes from 20 to 23%, and for the average American, goes to 32%. So basically, like, the source of the data combined with the direction of the result can have a major impact on the trust in the underlying article once people are aware of this disclosure. And then we do the same thing for multiple different vignettes. We have many vignettes. I'm not going to go through them all. You can check the paper and understand. So talking about antitrust and IO, I think something that Kanter's remarks speak to, the examples speak to. We had one vignette that was about the effects of a supermarket, an article studying the effects of supermarket mergers. So the idea of the paper is like, there's articles analyzing whether larger supermarket mergers are associated with either decreased consumer welfare due to higher prices, so companies get bigger, they have more market power, they charge more, or increased consumer welfare due to lower prices, so basically the opposite. Companies gain efficiencies in scale and then they basically charge lower prices. And then we treat people to ask, okay, now we just learned about the disclosure of a conflict, and you learn that one of the authors had worked either as an expert witness for the DOJ, for the Department of Justice, challenging a merger between two supermarkets, or the author had worked for an expert witness for the supermarket chains, basically for private parties who had their merger challenged by the DOJ. And then for some people, we don't tell them how much this person had been paid. And for others, we actually tell them that this person had been paid $400,000 in compensation for their work as an expert witness. And then what you see here is actually the affiliation. The work as an expert witness basically decreases trust across all the results, all the treatments, but the level varies a lot. And there are a couple of interesting facts that we can discuss more during the Q&A. So for example, the overall discount for a public expert witness in both criteria is smaller than the comparing discount for a private expert witness. So basically, when there's no mention of money, most people discount it little, 6-7% if you're an economist, 10% or average American. But if there's a mention of money that the person had been paid $400,000 for this testimony that was associated with the paper, then basically the discount grows by a lot. It goes to 25% for an average person and 16% for a selected economist. On the private side, the discount starts at a higher baseline. So the discount starts at 20%. And once there's a mention of compensation, the discount goes to 37, 35%, 34%. So basically, like this paper, the trustworthiness on the article is almost a third smaller than would have been otherwise once people didn't know about the conflict itself. One of the questions that comes out of this is like, oh, how much is this purely associative expertise, right? Basically, just people understand better how research is being done, and they basically they discount it less because they believe that the peer review system clears it out. So one of the things that we have is that we actually ask our respondents, especially the economist respondents, in which area are they working on? So basically they can say they are an IO economist, which is basically an antitrust economist, a financial economist, labor, macro, at different areas, and then we can look at these vignettes, looking at like, are people within the field answer it differently than people outside of the field. So that's basically what these results show. So what you should see here, for example, is that if you're an IO economist or an antitrust economist, your decrease in trust is much smaller than if you're a non-IO economist. And then you could talk about expertise. Very well-trained economists as well, or financial economists like Luigi, financial economists actually discount more than the IO economists. So they say like, oh, in finance, these people in IO, they're consulting a lot, they just don't trust the results more than the average economist, while the IO person actually discounts it less. But then we actually have a matching vignette that I won't present, which was the opposite. It was basically it involved a financial study, like the profitability of a trading strategy. And then the matter was about research grants. So basically the financial economists will get a research grant to study the profitability of the trading strategy. And then these results basically inverted. It's like the IO economists were like, no, these financial people, they're like totally impacted by the money. But then the financial people are like, oh no, here's the discount is smaller. And what I think this helps show is that there's some level of like in-group bias, that basically you protect your peers, but you're much more critical. And then getting to the final vignette that I'll discuss here, I think that also comes out of our research is that the terms of access, the terms of the relationship matter a lot. And I think that's something that we also don't talk much. So we have one vignette that also involves private data. It's studying actually the efficiency of credit card network payments. And basically the paper finds that the credit card networks are basically efficient, right? They run efficiently, but we tell them at the beginning that the data used in the paper was actually provided by the credit card company. Okay, so that's the initial world. They know they are writing an article, they are reading an article that's using private data. But then what we do in the treatment, we say, but the conditions under which this data has been supplied actually vary a lot. In one treatment, we say the credit card company waive its rights to review the paper. So they basically say, here's the data. do whatever you want with it, whatever you publish, it's yours, you own it. And on the other hand, the credit card company actually kept a right to review. So say like, you can run your study, but you're only going to be able to publish it if we take a look at the results before you can actually go live. And what you see is that in this dimension, there's a huge variation as well. So basically, across the board, but in particular among economists, once they are aware that the company had waived the right to review, had given the data without conditions, they significantly increase their trust in the results of the paper, even in a world where this is private data. On the other hand, once people are aware that there's basically a right to review, there's it's actually our largest drop in trust, which is basically to say that like data can even be more influential than money in some circumstances, because people just say like, oh, like by some degrees, like 60% distrust. You know, it's almost like this paper loses a lot of value. So this tells you that like the structure of these relationships matter significantly, maybe in many ways almost as much as the type of conflict that's being involved, and that's something that I think also comes out of the research. And then I'll say two quickly more things, then we'll go for questions. And so basically what we've been looking so far is this immediate reaction, right? We're basically concerned on whether like once you're aware of a conflict, how much does your immediate trust in the articles and the conclusion shift once this conflict is made aware? And this is an important reaction in and of itself. But there's also a second question, which is a broader question that's connected to trust in science more broadly, which is how much do you see the long-term value of such a paper, long-term impact of a paper on a marketplace of ideas once these conflicts become more widespread? And that's something that we get to the article by using a bit more of a simple model, but the intuition of what we're trying to do is the following. Imagine that there's never been a conflict before, and then you first read the first paper that had a conflict of interest. In that case, your discount of that paper should be basically the long-term discount that you're going to have on the value of the paper, because like the whole exposure is what is just the information that you just receive on the disclosure itself. The problem with our world right now, and I think the examples that you gave, Stefano, and the discussions that we had, the reason why we started working on this paper, make it clear is that this is not the world we live in, right? So basically, there's a lot of conflicts go in different directions, people have different relationships. And so when someone reads a paper and they don't actually know the disclosure, they don't know what kind of relationship these people, the authors are engaged in, a rational thing would be to just like estimate what should be the average level of conflict for that field, and then use that, and then once you're aware of the disclosure, you basically like change your beliefs. And so what we can do is that we can do the reverse engineering of this process. You know, because we have the level of discount, the immediate discount, if we can get information on how much conflict there was in the field to begin with, we can try to use this to think about how much would a rational person discount the long-term value of the paper, given the amount of conflict that exists in the world right now. And that's basically what we call in the article the COI discount. It's a second variable that is connected to our trustworthiness reduction, but is much more connected to this long-term value of the articles that reflects the current level of conflict that already exists in academia. And then to do this, I think it's important to put in context how much conflicts in general are increasing in academia overall. So this is data from the American Economic Review, which is the most prestigious economic journal that I think you have, at least one of the most prestigious, but I think is the like flagship journal. And this tells you, so this basically is telling you the amount of papers that have been published in the AER since 2005 until 2022. The blue line here shows the amount of papers that use some type of data. So basically there's empirical analysis. And you see basically the empirical revolution happening in economics is taking place across the board. And nowadays more than 80% of the papers basically have data analysis. But the red line here basically tells you the amount of papers that have been published with data exemptions. So this means that they have access to some form of private data that cannot be publicly disclosed to others. So basically like they publish the analysis, but they cannot publish data because the data has been private. And as you see, this is almost 50% of the 80-something% number of papers that are published in the AER overall. So we can do this type of analysis for all papers published in the AER, right? We can go there and check like what kind of data they're using, what kind of conflicts have they disclosed in their own conflict of interest disclosure statements right now. And basically what we see is that if you use a narrow version of a conflict of interest, one that excludes grants by the National Science Foundation, the Knight Foundation, Sloan Foundation, or these independent grant-making institutions, 60% of the papers that were published in the AER in 2022 and 2023, they have some form of conflict that includes money, right to review, data, other things. We're bundling them all together, but this basically tells you that the magnitude of the this level of embeddedness that exists more and more between academia and other organizations. If we actually use the broad version that also includes the NSF and NITE and so on, then it's going to depend a bit on what your views on these foundations are, and we just didn't want to impose our views on one or another direction, then 65% of the papers actually have some kind of conflict under this broader definition. So if we do this inverse calculation, or if we combine this distribution of conflicts with or reductions in trust, we can get to this quiet discount, and also like this notion like what should be the rational long-term discount of the value of the paper overall, and that's basically what you should see here. So basically, in a notion that like for the average article, this discount would be something between 49 to 53%. But then for the different types of relationship really matter. So if you're using private data, is around 40%. If you're a public expert witness getting paid $400,000, goes to around 40-something%. If you're getting a research grant, we have a vignette that's focused on research grants. People don't tend to differentiate much between research grants and consulting, for example. They see money coming from private parties. It's almost 58%. Private expert with the 60%, and then private data review wide 75%. We have a lot more results. I won't talk more. I'll stop here. We talk about ideology. We talk about political affiliation as well, a lot of other topics. But I think this tells you a little bit what we're trying to do and why we think that maybe our results help showcase as well why there's like increasing distrust of academia overall, science overall, and why these types of relationships may tell us something about it, why this process is happening in society more broadly. Thank you.
So thank you, Filippo. And let me add a couple of points, and then I want to open the floor to questions. Number one, since we have a lot of journalists on the call, we try to actually solicit opinions from all of you. We fail miserably because what we heard is that you have the best spam filters in the industry. And so our emails did not reach out. We had at the end 18 answers or 20 answers of journalists. So not enough to do anything with it. So in case you're one of the 18 who answered this question and you wonder why we don't have the answer, that's the reason. The second point I want to emphasize, because Filippo mentioned papers that are not published, working paper or think tanks paper, etc. And academics tend to be, especially sort of the most snobbish, tend to look down and say, oh, because of course, all this stuff is not cautious, not unbiased, but if you publish in the top journals, then this is the gold standard and you should trust 100%. And so what I find particularly remarkable of our research is that we tell economists themselves that this is published in a top journal, and they end up discounting massively the results. So this is not just a unpublished working paper problem, is just a large problem. And it's not just a conspiracy problem. Some of my colleagues dismissed and said, oh, but these are opinion of people that don't trust science, no vax, whatever. And the answer is no, because this is very widespread, even at the top of the profession, number one. And number two, we do a lot of work to show that in the cases in which we have a real correspondence, this discount, if anything, seems to be too little. One of my colleagues, Lubo Spaster, has a paper showing that, for example, if you work at a central bank and you write about quantitative easing, you're much more likely to find that quantitative easing has a good impact on GDP than if you're not working at a central bank. And I want to end with this because it's important. This is not just a feature of profit-making entities, because the government is one of the biggest offenders in this space. And it says the Federal Reserve has a lot of confidential data. And the Federal Reserve is one of those institutions that actually select papers that can be released. So there is a guy in charge to determine whether a result that is found by a researcher of the Fed can circulate or not. Now, what they tell me is that it's very rare that they use this selection, but we're all economists, we understand rational expectations, so they anticipate, and they're not writing paper, they're going to be selected out. So this is a very pervasive and important problem that nobody wants to talk about it, and I think that this webinar is about to raise this issue, so we're here to answer your questions.
Okay, thank you, Filippo and Luigi. We start with the Q&A. I just would like to answer to a question that was the comment that was directly to me by Mark Nefer, who's affiliated with George Mason Law School, and basically he contests that we mentioned sexual allegations against Joshua Wright, but we don't care. We don't want to discuss that. It was just meant to clarify that career problems of Joshua Wright started because of sexual allegation and not because of the topic that we are discussing here, which is conflict of interest between academic research and corporate funding, which means that corporate funding was fine in terms of career and reputation. That was the interesting part. Okay, let's move to the question about the paper. Ellen Partridge raises a question that is probably one of the central issues of the paper. Why do you think that ordinary people are more skeptical than experts? This is particularly true, and it was striking in Filippo's slides regarding proprietary data. Apparently, ordinary people who are not supposed to know anything about regressions and selection process, they are more skeptical. One answer is probably that economists know more, so they are more able to spot where the problems are, so they know how to detect a good research. Or probably it's just they don't want to criticize the profession. How do you answer, Filippo or Luigi? Maybe Luigi, because you are the economist of the group.
So I think is a little bit of both. In a sense, one of the reasons why we want to ask to both groups is precisely to see what effect dominates. It could be that people don't understand this very much. So, for example, one of the vignettes we have is about what we call academic conflict. Somebody that has written all his life about one topic, and is very aware that at the end of his life he finds a result that contradicts what he has done all his life. Now, if you do empirical research, you should sometimes find results that contradicts what he has said before. So we find that, for example, the public at large is not sensitive at all to this conflict of interest, does not perceive, and academic economists do perceive it because it's more subtle, and so they don't understand. So that's a case in which you can say is the public might understand less than the people involved. And the importance, for example, of data, this is something that academic economists might understand much more than the other. However, I do think there is also the other effect, which is not in my backyard. When you get closer to your area, you say, oh, my friends cannot possibly do that, because if they do that, that means that I would do that as well. And we're very clear in the paper that we don't need to assume, and we don't assume any malignity here, because a motivated reasoning is good enough to deliver the results. And it's as if I have a strong prior and I find a result that doesn't make sense, I'm more likely to check whether there is a data mistake than if there is not. If I find a result I was expecting, I'm not going to check all the data 3 times, because that's what I expected. So there is a natural bias, and even if people are not in any way corrupt, and that's what we try to figure it out and try to fix it at the aggregate level.
Let me compliment. I think first, starting with Luigi's final point, this is not a paper about corruption in academia, though like our results can also speak a bit to that. I think this is a paper about conflicts of interest and the ways through which this type of relationships can influence academic studies outside of even like, this is like, we're assuming well-meaning, motivated people. Like there's not a prior. This is like serious studies that's done by serious people, but even still you can find an impact, can find an effect. And then I think this connects to the first main question, which is that once you average out the results, and we do, I mean, it's a shorter presentation, but we do this a bit more in detail in the article itself, you actually find some interesting levels of interaction. So I talked a little bit about the IO economists versus the finance economists and vice versa. I know what they say, like, oh, IO conflicts in IO are fine, but IO conflicts in finance are not fine. You also see this, for example, with private data. So one of the things that you see is that the economists who had self-reported in our survey, having used private data in the past, significantly increase more their trust of the paper once they know there's public data involved. And discount more once they know that there's a right to review involved. So it's basically like how was the saying, like burnt once. I mean, it's not even burnt once, but like if you know what kind of level the relationship, what happens in this type of relationships, you can be more or less skeptical. And this also, I think, one of the results that we have is also, which I find it really interesting, we didn't cover here, is about political affiliation. So we have a vignette that talks, for example, about abortion and about like papers that study abortion and whether the author is a Democrat and a Republican. And you have very interesting results there that talk a little bit about like the level of embeddedness of like political ideology and the results of the article. So for example, Republicans discount much more across the board than Democrats do, and vice versa. I think that's something that we can talk more about it if you want to go more into detail of that vignette. But I think this shows in different areas. For example, in the access to data vignette that I told you about, if you're very conservative, we have results for very conservative people, then basically you distrust equally public and private data. But if you're very liberal, you trust public data much more than you trust private data. And so we can kind of disaggregate this, and this paints a much more complex, much more interesting, much more nuanced picture of how people are reacting to this type of external influences in research than simply what the aggregate results show and that you can present here. So I think this for me are all fascinating results, and I think talk a little bit about the complexity of the topic, but why it's so important to talk about it very openly and very clearly, because if we don't discuss these results, then basically we just aggregate them all and then you miss all the subtleness as well.
Okay, I think that you partially already responded to John Scott's question, because John is asking basically if the distrust in academic research is part of a bigger problem of declining trust in public institutions such as government, Supreme Court, and so on. But if I understood correctly, basically you are controlling for this, general distrust, because basically you check the discount factor, which means that it doesn't matter the starting point, but you see the impact of conflict of interest. But the second part of the question is, how do you fix this? So based on your findings, how do you fix this problem? Is there any way to mitigate the negative externality that basically conflict of interest produce and on the academic research as a whole? So do we have just to improve disclosure policies, or should we ban some form of academic research, for example, on proprietary data? Or maybe we need a different policy for op-eds in newspapers, for example, or as closer as we get to the final user of academic research, it seems that disclosure policies become less and less relevant.
I'll start with the first question. I think Luigi can jump on the second question. I think on the first question, I think is important to say that this was basically one of the motivations for this study to begin with, right? So this notion that we're losing trust in some institutions, academia included, but we don't understand exactly why. Maybe it's just politicization. Maybe it's just that these institutions are under attack by the media. What we try to do is, this was basically the motivation for, that's why we started working it 2.5 years ago, not now, was, is conflict of interest part of the problem, right? Is there a growing prevalence of conflict of interest? And is this growing prevalence also part of this like distrust in academia more generally? And I think one of the things that we didn't talk about in the presentation, we talk a bit more in the article, is that we basically have an externality problem, which is that, so one of the things that we do in the survey is that we ask people to talk about the disclosure of their own conflict of interest. How well have they disclosed their conflicts in the past? And everybody says very well. And then we ask them, well, how well do you believe that your peers have disclosed their conflicts? And everybody's like, I'm not very sure. Like that's basically like, I'm not sure, they're like 50% or even going down. And so part about, I think Luigi can talk more about it, about the solutions. I'm sure he'll happy to talk about it because it's one of his favorite topic. But like, I think what we're trying to show with the article is that like this increasing prevalence of conflict of interest generates a negative externality that mostly impacts the serious researchers. If disclosures are non-credible, and you basically have an over-incentive to produce conflicted ideas, people over time trust less and less science, and these has repercussions for science itself, but could even have repercussions for other institutions. We don't study this, but that's something that would be reasonable, I think, to speculate. And so I'll leave it to Luigi to jump in on how we fix it, because it's
Before I go out to fix it, I want to slightly correct what Stefano said. In the sense, it is true that we look at the surprise when we reveal a conflict of interest. But it's also true that if our results are correct, this level of discount does put a weight on the trust that people have to our academia in general, and I would say more broadly to our institutions. I think that there is a diffusion, if you want, of the capture idea that was introduced by Stigler, or the namesake of the center. That in the old days, people would say that only regulators were captured. And what we're trying to do with this paper, what I'm trying to do for a long time, is try to say, no, this is a much broader phenomenon that apply to a lot of other institutions. And academia is one, but certainly you can think about the Supreme Court, you can think about a lot of other things. And it really undermines the functioning of a democratic system. The reason why people don't in my view, support, especially young people, support democracy as they used to, is because their view of democracy is quite diminished by all these problems. And so it becomes really, really important in the way how to fix it. And I think that what this paper does not do, I want to be very clear, is look at what are the benefits of conflicted research. Because at the end of the day, if I want to analyze today, if I want to analyze what happens with social media, I need to have the permission of Meta or Twitter or Google. Okay? Now, as the digital report that Filippo contributed in drafting several years ago suggests, is we need a public access to data to have independent research. So that's the first order of solution that I would propose. Now, this of course require a legislative act, which ain't easy these days, but nevertheless it's important to stress. At a more academic level, what can we do? I don't think we want to prohibit the research done with metadata. However, we want to discount it properly. So when I saw that one of the questions was about antitrust, there are a lot of papers that are presented in antitrust cases. And as far as I know, in a traditional antitrust case, nobody discussed the conflict of interest of the authors of those studies. And so if I am testifying in a case of merger of two supermarkets, just an example, and I've been working for Walmart all my life, I'm probably not as unbiased as if I'm an independent researcher. And so every research that is coming from employees of Walmart with Walmart data or financed by Walmart should be discounted. How much? We provide the number to discount. And we're saying that basically is worth, in some cases, almost like a quarter of one. So if you have 5 papers in one direction and then 20 in the other, but 5 are independent, the 5 independent counts like as much as the 20 in the other. So that really is changing dramatically the way we interpret the data. The other thing that we academics can do is enforce better disclosure of the conditions under which the data are obtained. I asked in a promotion case at Chicago to make this public, and the answer I got is the lawyers don't allow this to be disclosed. I said, wait a minute, you are under a contract that I can obtain the data of Facebook under the condition that if I say something negative about Facebook, they take away my firstborn son? Is that kind of a possibility? I think is appalling that journals are not requiring that and putting that on their disclosure page of all the articles. And in the process of accepting papers, they should be much more rigorous with papers that are conflicted. In fact, one of the ideas for this type of vignette came from the fact that many years ago, when I was president of the American Financial Association, I got involved in a dispute of a paper that had been accepted but not published yet, and then was disclosed there was a conflict of interest. And so there was the debate about what to do. And I said the solution is very simple. We go back to the editor who accepted, we give the extra information, and we ask, do you change your mind or not? Okay? And to my surprise, the editor did change their mind, and the paper was unaccepted. But that's exactly what we need to do, is we need to think more carefully and put a higher burden of proof for papers that are conflicted.
Okay,
thank you.
One second, just to say something that I think is important. I think it's always important, at least for me as a young scholar and a young researcher, to keep in mind the negative externality that's generated by these types of conflicts, right? Because if you look, for example, at this private access to data, that's an area where the real loss to society, like you have gains that come from the private papers there. The papers that are written with private data, they wouldn't have been written otherwise. And that's a clear gain. We should think about what to do with them, but like, there's no banning this type of research is not a good way forward, because we want to get this data, we want to get the knowledge. The real problem that happens, though, is that academics fully internalize the benefits of these relationships, right? So you publish an extremely high-profile paper using internal data from Meta, and that's awesome, and people learn it, and then your career takes off, and then you get tenure, for example. But so no one internalizes the fact that we're only studying the benefits of Meta, but no one is studying teenage depression, for example, because Meta holds all the data necessary to run these studies. They will never allow external researchers to do this type of study. And so these overall, one society only sees papers that are good for Facebook, but don't see any papers that are bad for Facebook, they discount science. They say like, oh, scientists are not looking at important questions, just looking at whether Facebook is delivering benefits. And then this negative externality is basically borne by everyone else, and in particularly borne by young researchers who get the cost but don't get the benefits, because most of the times they don't even have the relationship. You know? So that's why I think it's important to always keep in mind this negative externality dimension of these types of relationships. That happens also for consulting, you know, like you get the money, but no one else internalizes the discounting in the trust in the research overall.
Thank you, Filippo, because you mentioned that there is a negative externality also in selection of academics. So there is a negative selection, basically, that the system encourages using conflicted data, because it's a monopoly on information, and this helps your career, because as Luigi said, it's not properly discounted in terms of relevance. Okay, so you probably already answered to the point that I think Francisco Silva was raising: which form of public intervention, of government intervention, should we advocate or hope for? And basically Luigi said we do not need intervention in the content of the paper, but probably I mean in protecting the equal access to data. Maybe we don't even need the government intervention. Maybe you can partially fix it at university level. If the university bargain as a single entity with companies, maybe that would be more effective. Guy Rolnick, our friend Guy.
Stefano, let me double down on this, because I think that it's very easy to say what the government should do, because we know that, especially in the United States, sort of Congress is paralyzed, nothing is done. So you can say whatever, and then live happily ever after. What we are saying here is there is a lot that we can do as individual member of the profession, and one is to challenge, for example, in promotion decision, what is the value of this research, and let's be reassured that when this is challenged, people start to learn pretty fast. The second is start to demand from our association, from the American Economic Review, the American Financial Association, etc., stronger standards on that dimension, and require from our universities more disclosure, because at the end of the day, if the university starts to have a rule, then even the companies need to sort of subject themselves to those rules, and the individual researcher has a stronger sort of support in bargaining with companies if it has the support of the university. So I think that there are a lot of things that can be done at the local level, and in an ideal world, we will have mandatory data sharing with a data authority as we ask a Stigler Center. But I think that unfortunately I don't see this coming anytime soon.
Okay, thank you. And our friend Guy Rolnick, who is a professor at Booth, he raises another interesting point. What happens if there is no direct conflict of interest in the specific paper, but rather a disclosure that the authors of the papers are compensated by other companies? I think that more in general, it means that if you're not conflicted in that specific paper, but you have plenty of other commitments and other projects that might create a conflict, how you discount for that?
I don't think it's easy. That's part of the reason why we started with this survey, is because we wanted to study the impact of conflict of interest, but we disagree even among the team of authors how to define the conflict of interest and what constitutes a conflict of interest. So I think this is a question that need to be researched more, and we're planning to do so.
Yeah,
Okay.
if I might something, because there's also a question in the Q&A, like what if you have multiple conflicted authors, or like just one author among multiple? So the way that we saw this research is this is all this is not true for in medicine. There's a lot of studies studying conflict of interest. You know, there's like, we actually did a literature review. There are like dozens of meta studies, like thousands of articles that have studied topics like that. But in economics, in law, this is a non-topic. Okay, we don't talk about it because we don't want to talk about it. So what we try to do here is to have a first study that we hope will open a much broader and important conversation on this type of subtleness. Like, what if the paper directly is not conflicted, but the person has multiple other relationships? How do you trace it down back to the paper itself? What if one author is conflicted, but the others are not? These are all important questions, but there are questions that before I think this paper, no one would dare, let me say no one would dare to ask, but like would be unpleasant to ask. And we're hoping that this study will help ignite a field of research that exists in other areas of research in medicine and other fields, to talk about much more seriously about what are independent sources of influence in academic research, external sources of influence in academic research, and how do they impact our conclusions. Maybe I'm too optimistic, but that's why we talk about starting a conversation rather than finalizing it.
Cool. Okay, we still have 5 more minutes. We have Edward Naranjo, who asked about white papers that several companies publish. Have you evaluated the discount of these private publications or not?
No, we have not, so we cannot extrapolate.
Yeah.
But I think as a journalist, I can try to answer. I think my impression is that the discount factor in that case is much higher than it's pretty easy to discount to correct the value of this kind of publication, because the conflict of interest is so explicit that there is no real debate.
Yeah, it connects with the other question. Like, our assumption is that these papers have been peer reviewed, published in the top journals, and even then we find very harsh discounts. I think if you were to extrapolate, you'll probably find even larger discounts for non-peer reviewed articles and working papers. But that's just my gut feeling, that our data doesn't speak directly to that, and we don't have anything that speaks directly to that.
Utsav Gandhi asked about a potential selection problem, because if only people who are already, exposed to the problem answer the survey. He says that basically, what challenges did you face in gathering survey responses and data for this project, and what can that tell us about any potential selection among those who respond strongly to the survey?
So I think that's a very good question. And the good news is, among the selected economies, we had almost a 20% response rate, that in this type of survey is really, really large. So even if we take it for granted that this is the top 20% of the most concerned people in the profession, if 1/5 of the top in the profession thinks so negatively about conflicts and the effect of conflict, this is per se interesting. Second, we have a much higher degree of attrition in the broader set of economies. We don't find a dramatic difference, at least in the average between the two, suggesting that conflict is not an issue. Third, for average American, this is a sample of YouGov, so there is no selection in this front, and we still have similar results. So is it something to be concerned about? Absolutely. Do we think that the results are dramatically impacted by that? I don't think so.
Blas Zaga asked if this problem can become of general interest and that media can start to become more sensitive to it, like they are about plagiarism, which is how to say, it's a proxy for relevance. So if someone has plagiarized a part of this his work, maybe you cannot trust the rest, which is not plagiarized. So I mean, I know I'm the journalist, but since you are the economist and the lawyer, do you expect that there is a conversation starting from this paper, or do you expect any pushback in terms of public discourse?
What is different between what I expect and what I would like? What I expect is a deafening silence, because to be honest, 10 years ago, I wrote a paper that made a very simple point that the same incentives that capture regulators can capture academics as well. Is one of my least cited papers ever. Nobody wants to talk about it because, as you said from the beginning, Stefano, economists think that incentives apply to everybody except themselves. Which seems like to defy gravity. But however, I hope that this will start a conversation, and a conversation that will make it easier also for people to verify a conflict of interest. In a sense, I ask around all my friends who have been editors of major journals, how many referees, for example, disqualify themselves because of a financial conflict of interest or data conflict of interest. And everybody told me the only case in which they refuse is if they are co-author or they are the advisor of the paper or the person whose paper they have to review. But none has revealed a financial conflict of interest. Now, given the pervasiveness of this conflict of interest, the chances that you get a conflicted referee approaches pretty quickly 1. And so that has real implication for what gets published and what doesn't get published. And I think that editors should do a serious analysis on this and try to, so hopefully we get enough of the editor's attention to change things.
If I can add two cents on Luigi's answer, I think that, so it's always hard to gauge the reaction to any paper, right? But what has been both rewarding and I think a bit sad is that a lot of young scholars reached out to me with a lot of praise for this article, but they did much less in public, you know. So basically, like, they're also afraid of this type of relationships and what it means for their potential careers, exactly because I think some of the dynamics that Luigi described. And so in a way, this shows that there is interest and there's a lot of people want to talk about it, but there's also like a strong push to just like hide whatever the news are under the carpet. And that's why I think it connects to the other part of the question, like what is the role of the media here? And I feel like as in any area, the media has to report on what's relevant. A lot of what we learn about conflicts of interest in academia actually comes from incredible investigative news reporting by the Wall Street Journal, by the New York Times, by multiple other organizations and publications. They were looking at these topics in depth and coming very clear stories that show this. And so I think it would be great if we continue to have these conversations more broadly, and if the media continues to engage in this chat, will be for us will be important, because I think ultimately you need all types of like dynamics and pressures for change to happen, you know, and it's not only happening only from like internally, but also I think it's important to get a broader conversation going about this, because ultimately, as I mentioned in my initial remarks, the media is reading these papers, reporting on it, discussing it, and this overall shapes public opinion and shapes public discourse in a way that can be detrimental to society, or sometimes can be positive, right? Some of our results show that if you use public data, that's great. You should be reporting on that more. You know, maybe the people who go through the trouble of getting public data, of getting good terms with the data providers, of not consulting each, etc., people have less conflicts to disclose. They will be encouraged to disclose this more, work more outside of this type of relationships, exactly because they get more rewards from journalists who then report on their work and say like, oh, this is like an unbiased publication, we can trust it more than if it had a lot of like the person had been a consultant for the company before, and then you don't get this type of disclosure in the news reports themselves.
Yeah, I totally agree, and think that maybe we can close on this positive note that basically your findings are not the end of this conversation, but they're just the beginning. And I think that everybody should do its part, or his or her part. I mean, Luigi mentioned journals editors. I mentioned, I mean, reporters and media should tell stories that fit with the framework that you provide with the paper. So you analyze data, you didn't deal with a single stories when you do not do any name and shame. Not even Jonathan Kanter did it in his speech that we mentioned at the beginning. But I think that is precisely the role of the media. So now everybody knows that the issue is relevant. So now it's time to discuss single stories and to get to dive into that. And I think everybody should do his or her part. So I don't know if you want to add any final comments, or Luigi or you, Filippo. Otherwise, we can thank you all. And
I think Luigi is initially disconnected, but I think I'll
okay.
ask a final question here. So, I mean, there's a lot more to discuss. We hope again that this webinar is just the beginning of this conversation rather than the end, right? So we published this paper a week ago, and we're trying to use these and these discussions to start a very important conversation among academics ourselves, right? To see like to what extent our practices are impacting our work, and if we can have like both a self-reflection and a broader public reflection about how external sources can impact academic work, because I do believe, and I think everybody believes in the value of academia as an independent source of knowledge. Like like advocates have their role in policy, academics have their role in, the journalists have their role in policy, politicians have we all have different roles to play. And I think Kanter's speech speaks very clearly about the different roles that should be played. But there should be a safeguarding of independence and that's crucial for the type of conversations that we're having right now. And so hopefully this will help ignite a broader conversation on how do we safeguard this independence, not at the cost of advocates. Like these are very important too, you know, but we should just make sure that whatever is produced at least independently in academia is indeed independent versus like embedded in relationships that we don't know, we don't understand, and that ultimately may harm trust in science more broadly. So that's what I hope comes out of this conversation of our articles, that we can kickstart this debate much more openly than we did before.
Okay, thank you so much, Filippo, for this great conclusion. Thank you also to Luigi, who had to leave because of another commitment, and thank you all to the Stigler team. Thank you all for attending, and this is just the beginning.
Thank you, Stefano. Thank you, everyone, for listening in. Bye-bye.